It's the story of a real mummy the world thought was fake, until a 1970s TV show inadvertently exposed the gruesome truth.
The Wild West wasn't just about duels and dusty saloons. It was also home to some of the weirdest happenings you'll ever hear.
5 long years, Elmer's body remains in the corner of this Oklahoma funeral home, until one day, he's claimed.
The frontier was a breeding ground for odd stories, unexplained events, and downright weird moments you wouldn't believe if they weren't true. Saddle up for the strangest tales from the untamed West. 1. Disregard for the dead. Elmer McCurdy's story is one of the strangest in history. A petty outlaw in the early 1900s, McCurdy bungled a train robbery in Oklahoma in 1911, making off with just $46 and some whiskey. He was killed shortly after in a shootout with law enforcement. When a funeral home embalmed his body, no one came to claim it, so the undertaker displayed McCurdy as a preserved outlaw and charged visitors a nickel to see him. Years later, McCurdy's body was sold to carnival promoters, kicking off a bizarre post-mortem journey. For decades, his mummified corpse toured the U.S. as a sideshow attraction, billed as everything from a train robber to a Wild West gunslinger. By the 1930s, his origins were largely forgotten, and McCurdy was treated more like a prop than a person. In 1976, McCurdy's body was rediscovered under bizarre circumstances. While filming an episode of The $6 Million Man at a Long Beach funhouse, a crew member accidentally broke off what they thought was a mannequin's arm, but it wasn't. It was a mummified human, and what they thought was plastic inside the arm was the human bone inside. The discovery led to a whole investigation, and forensic experts eventually identified the body as McCurdy's through a mix of dental records and historical documents. Today, McCurdy is buried in Guthrie, Oklahoma, under a concrete slab to prevent further travel. His story remains a macabre example of how Wild West legends lived on, even in the strangest ways. Want to learn about other weird things happening in the Wild West like these? Like this video and subscribe to our channel for more videos just like this. We've got a lot more where that came from. 2. The Earp Vendetta Ride. After the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881, tensions in Tombstone, Arizona came to a dangerous level. Wyatt Earp and his brothers, Morgan and Virgil, were locked in a deadly feud with the outlaw cowboys. The situation turned personal when Morgan was ambushed and fatally injured while playing pool, and Virgil was severely injured in a separate attack. Wyatt, enraged and determined to exact justice, formed a posse and began what would become known as the Earp Vendetta Ride. The ride was not about the law, it was about vengeance. With Doc Holliday and a few loyal followers by his side, Wyatt hunted down those responsible for the attacks. Over the course of several weeks, the posse tracked and killed at least 3 members of the cowboy gang, including Frank Stillwell and Curly Bill Brocious. The confrontations were ruthless, with no room for arrests or trials. Wyatt's pursuit of vengeance ultimately forced him to leave Arizona under threat of legal action and retaliation. The Earp Vendetta Ride cemented his reputation as a larger-than-life figure of the Wild West, a man willing to take justice into his own hands regardless of the consequences. Why? Because 2 men just couldn't settle a dispute. 3. Coffin racing. Coffin racing in Leadville, Colorado is one of the Wild West's most bizarre traditions. It's a bit of both legend and dark humor, but it's one we just can't ignore. The story dates back to the late 19th century during Leadville's gold rush era. According to local lore, a well-known prospector named Emma Crawford passed away, leaving instructions to be buried on a nearby mountaintop. Her friends and miners honored her wishes, but faced a unique challenge: racing her coffin up the rugged terrain to the burial site. It wasn't an easy way up, so making a challenge out of it was the only way they could stay motivated, especially with all the grief they were dealing with too. The journey turned into a spectacle, with townsfolk cheering as the miners struggled to carry the heavy casket up the steep mountain. The event, though somber, reflected the community's resilient and quirky spirit. Over time, the story faded into local lore until it was revived in the 20th century as a tongue-in-cheek competition. Today, Leadville celebrates this odd history with the Emma Crawford Coffin Races, an annual event where teams of participants build elaborate, decorated coffins and race them through town. The event has become a mix of athleticism, creativity, and humor, attracting thousands of spectators. While the races have evolved into a lighthearted celebration, they still remind everyone of the rugged determination of Leadville's past, keeping the town's unique Wild West heritage alive in a truly unconventional way. 4. The disappearance of Olive Oatman. Olive Oatman's disappearance remains one of the Wild West's most mysterious and haunting stories. In 1851, the Oatman family was traveling west to California when they were ambushed by a group of Native Americans, believed to be Yavapai. Most of the family didn't make it, but Olive, 14, and her younger sister Mary Ann were taken captive. The sisters were forced into slavery, enduring harsh conditions, until they were eventually traded to the Mojave tribe. Among the Mojave, Olive and Mary Ann's lives changed significantly. They were treated as part of the tribe, but Mary Ann eventually succumbed to starvation during a drought. Olive, however, adapted to her new life. During her time with the Mojave, she was given a distinctive chin tattoo, a traditional mark of acceptance within the tribe. 5 years later, Olive was ransomed and returned to white society. Her reappearance caused a sensation, but she struggled to reintegrate into her old world. The tattoo on her chin served as a permanent reminder of her time with the Mojave, starting conversations wherever she went. Olive later gave public lectures about her experience, though some details of her story remain untold, leading to ongoing debates about her true relationship with the Mojave. But that doesn't make her experience any less weird. 5. The Bisbee Massacre. The Bisbee Massacre of 1883 is one of the most shocking and violent crimes in Wild West history. It all began as a simple robbery orchestrated by a gang of 5 men in Bisbee, Arizona, then a booming mining town. The target was the Goldwater and Castaneda store, which also housed the local payroll funds. The robbers, led by Daniel Big Dan Dowd, believed a significant amount of money was stored there, but their intelligence was disastrously wrong. On December 8, 1883, the gang stormed the store. To their disappointment, the payroll funds hadn't yet arrived, leaving them with only a small amount of cash and goods. Frustrated, the robbers turned violent, shooting and eliminating 4 innocent bystanders, including a pregnant woman and a young boy. Their brutality shocked the town, which had never experienced violence on such a scale. The gang fled the scene, but the citizens of Bisbee quickly organized a posse to track them down. Over the next few days, all 5 men were captured and brought to justice. They were tried in a hastily arranged court session and sentenced to death by hanging. On March 28, 1884, the gang members were executed together in Tombstone, Arizona, in one of the largest public hangings in the territory's history. The Bisbee Massacre became infamous not just for its senseless violence, but also for the swift and decisive response from the townspeople. Today, the story remains a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurked in even the most industrious frontier towns. 6. Rainmakers. In the late 1800s, drought-stricken farmers in Kansas turned to an unusual solution to summon rain: dynamite. Desperation drove them to hire rainmakers, self-proclaimed weather experts who claimed they could force the skies to open by creating explosions in the atmosphere. One of the most notorious figures was Charles Hatfield, though other lesser-known rainmakers gained fame in Kansas and neighboring states. The method was as simple as it was absurd. Large amounts of dynamite or explosives were shot into the air or detonated on the ground with the belief that the vibrations would trigger cloud condensation. Farmers and townsfolk, often skeptical but hopeful, gathered to watch these explosive displays. While the spectacle offered entertainment, it rarely brought the promised rain. Despite the lack of scientific backing, rainmaking with dynamite gained popularity, partly because of coincidental rains that sometimes followed explosions. This led to a bizarre trend that persisted for years in rural areas. The practice became so widespread that the U.S. government briefly funded experiments in weather modification, though these efforts also failed to produce consistent results. Today, rainmaking with dynamite is remembered as one of the Wild West's strangest attempts to battle nature's unpredictability, but we can't help but think this might just be one of the weirdest things that went on for a really long time throughout history. 7. Camel Corps Experiment. The Camel Corps Experiment was a short-lived but fascinating chapter in the Wild West's history. In the 1850s, the U.S. Army sought better ways to transport supplies across the arid Southwest. Camels, known for their ability to endure harsh desert conditions, seemed like the perfect solution. Congress allocated $30,000 in 1855 to purchase camels from the Middle East and North Africa. Under the leadership of Major Henry C. Wayne and Naval Officer David Dixon Porter, the Army imported 75 camels and hired camel handlers to manage them. Initially, the experiment showed promise. Camels could carry heavier loads than horses or mules, travel longer distances without water, and navigate rough desert terrain with ease. However, they came with unique challenges. The animals were notoriously stubborn, frightened horses with their unfamiliar appearance and smell, and their handlers often clashed with soldiers unfamiliar with their care. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 doomed the project. With resources diverted to the war effort, the Camel Corps was abandoned. Many camels were sold off to private owners or simply released into the wild, where they roamed the deserts of the Southwest for decades, becoming the stuff of local legend. Sightings of feral camels persisted into the early 20th century, adding to the mystique of this peculiar military endeavor. Though the Camel Corps ultimately failed, it remains a symbol of the U.S. Army's willingness to experiment with unconventional solutions in a challenging frontier environment. 8. Dancing Plague. In the late 1800s, Dodge City, Kansas, a rough-and-tumble Wild West hub, was reportedly struck by an eerie phenomenon, the Dancing Plague. This bizarre outbreak saw groups of people suddenly compelled to dance uncontrollably for hours or even days. Witness accounts describe participants moving as if they were a wall in a trance, oblivious to exhaustion, injury, or their surroundings. The cause of these outbreaks is still a mystery. Some historians speculate that they were triggered by mass hysteria, a psychological phenomenon often led by extreme stress or fear. Dodge City was a chaotic place at the time, filled with outlaws, lawmen, and constant threats of violence, which could have created the perfect conditions for such collective episodes. Others suggest the phenomenon may have been linked to ergot poisoning, caused by a fungus on grains, which can induce hallucinations and convulsions. Local doctors were baffled and unable to provide effective treatment. Remedies ranged from playing calming music to attempting to restrain the afflicted, but the outbreaks eventually stopped as suddenly as they started. While the reports of Dodge City's dancing plague were never as well documented as similar events in Europe, they remain an intriguing part of Wild West folklore. 9. Dead Man's Hand. The Dead Man's Hand is one of the most famous legends from the Wild West, tied to the infamous gunfighter and lawman Wild Bill Hickok. The story goes that on August 2, 1876, Hickok was sitting at a poker table in the number 10 saloon in Deadwood, South Dakota, when he was shot and killed by Jack McCall. Hickok, known for his quick draw and sharpshooting skills, was holding a hand of aces and eights, two pairs that would forever be etched into history as the Dead Man's Hand. The details of Hickok's final moments are shrouded in mystery. He was playing poker with his back to the door when McCall, who had personal grievances with Hickok, shot him in the back of the head. It is said that Hickok had just been dealt the aces and eights, and this combination of cards became associated with his death. Over time, the Dead Man's Hand gained a reputation as a cursed hand of cards. Some legends claim that the hand brought bad luck to anyone who held it, and it became synonymous with violent, untimely death. However, the exact details of the hand Hickok was holding have been questioned. Some historians believe it may not have been aces and eights at all, but rather a different hand. Despite the uncertainty surrounding the cards, the Dead Man's Hand remains one of the most enduring symbols of the Wild West, a reminder of Hickok's dramatic life and death. 10. Woman Undercover. The Wild West wasn't just a place for men to make their mark. It also saw the rise of the daring of women like Pearl Hart, who defied gender norms by becoming infamous stagecoach robbers. During the late 1800s, Pearl Hart and other women like her disguised themselves as men, taking on the role of outlaws in a male-dominated frontier world. Pearl Hart's story is one of the most well-known among female stagecoach robbers. In 1899, after years of struggling financially and enduring personal hardships, Hart and her accomplice, Joe Boot, decided to rob a stagecoach in Arizona. Hart, dressed in men's clothes and wearing a slouch hat to conceal her identity, stopped a stagecoach near a remote stretch of road. Armed with a revolver, she and Boot ordered the driver to hand over the valuables, and they made off with a small sum of money. Though their robbery was successful, their escape didn't last long. The pair were quickly apprehended, and Hart's trial became a sensation. She was one of the few women in the West to be charged with stagecoach robbery, but her charm and story won the public's sympathy. 11. Crazed cannibals, the Saitaka Giants. One of the most enduring and chilling legends of the American West involves a mysterious tribe of red-haired giants known as the Saitaka, who were said to have roamed the region of Nevada long before European settlers arrived. According to local Native American tribes, the Saitaka were an ancient and terrifying group of people, described as giants, often standing between 8 and 10 feet tall, with distinctive red hair and pale skin. The Saitaka were not just feared for their size and strength, but also for their rumored cannibalistic practices. Stories from various Native American tribes, including the Paiutes, suggest that the giants would raid smaller tribes, kidnapping people to eat. These tales paint the Saitaka as ruthless predators, living in caves and the remote mountain regions of Nevada, where they could ambush travelers or villagers. The most famous version of the legend is tied to a supposed conflict between the Saitaka and the Paiutes. According to some accounts, the Paiutes eventually fought back against the giants, using fire and spears to drive them into caves. The Saitaka were said to have been trapped in these caves, where they died out, their remains eventually disappearing, leaving only the legend behind. The mystery of the Saitaka has intrigued historians, archaeologists, and enthusiasts for years. Some claim that the remains of these giants were once discovered in caves, though such evidence has never been conclusively proven. Skeptics believe the stories were exaggerated or mythologized over time, possibly linked to ancient encounters between different tribes or even early settlers. But because of the caves, everyone believes that even if the stories are a bit exaggerated, these men actually existed. 12. The Crazy Crash at Crush. In 1896, one of the most bizarre and tragic spectacles of the Wild West took place in the small Texas town of Crush, staged by a railroad executive named William Crush. The event, designed as a marketing stunt for the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, involved 2 fully operational steam trains crashing into each other at high speed. Crush, wanting to draw attention to his railroad company and boost ticket sales, promoted the event as a thrilling attraction for thrill seekers and railroad enthusiasts alike. On September 15, 1896, over 40,000 spectators gathered along the tracks, eager to witness the stage collision. The idea was that 2 trains would race toward each other, collide, and explode in a spectacular display of power and destruction. Spectators paid for tickets to get a close view, and many gathered dangerously close to the tracks. As the trains approached each other, the excitement reached a fever pitch. However, disaster struck when the collision occurred. The 2 trains crashed with a deafening roar, but the force of the impact caused flying debris, including a large piece of the boiler, to shoot out into the crowd. The explosion and flying shrapnel resulted in the deaths of 2 spectators and left hundreds more injured. The tragic accident made headlines across the country, and the stunt's horrific aftermath served as a grim reminder of the dangers involved in such reckless spectacles. Though Crush's intention had been to create a sensational event, the public outrage and the loss of life forced the railroad company to abandon similar stunts in the future. The Crazy Crash at Crush remains one of the most notorious examples of Wild West spectacle gone horribly wrong. 13. The Emu War. The Emu War of 1932 is one of the most bizarre and humorous conflicts in history. So much so that it sounds totally made up, but it isn't. It's very real. It took place in Western Australia, where farmers faced a growing problem: emus. After World War I, many Australian soldiers were given land to farm. But in the early 1930s, a severe drought and the Great Depression made farming conditions tough. To make matters worse, large flocks of emus began to invade farmland, ravaging wheat crops and threatening the already struggling industry. In response, the government decided to send soldiers to deal with the avian menace. In November 1932, armed with machine guns, soldiers led by Major G.P.W. Meredith was tasked with reducing the emu population, which had reached approximately 20,000 birds. The The soldiers set out to cull the emus, expecting an easy victory. However, the emus proved far more resilient than anticipated. Despite being shot at with automatic weapons, the birds outran the soldiers, scattered into small groups, and took advantage of the terrain, making them difficult targets. In several encounters, soldiers found themselves unable to hit the fast-moving birds effectively. The emus also seemed to learn from their experiences, quickly adapting to the human threat. Over the course of the operation, the soldiers failed to significantly reduce the emu population, despite using military-grade equipment. The emu enemy proved to be an unexpected force, and after several weeks, the government decided to withdraw the troops, declaring a comedic defeat. The Emu War became a symbol of nature's resilience and a reminder of the absurdity of human attempts to control the natural world. Though the Emu War was largely a failure for the soldiers, it's something that can never really be forgotten. 14. Buffalo Bill's Bison Slaughter. William Buffalo Bill. Cody is famous for his role in shaping the mythology of the Wild West, particularly through his Wild West shows. However, his legacy is also marred by his involvement in the mass slaughter of bison during the late 19th century. As part of his job with the Kansas Pacific Railroad, Cody was hired to hunt bison to provide meat for the railroad workers and to clear the land for expansion. What started as a practical effort to feed workers quickly turned into a large-scale campaign that contributed significantly to the near extinction of the bison population. Between 1867 and 1868, Buffalo Bill Cody is said to have killed an astonishing 4,000 bison in just 2 years. His skill as a marksman allowed him to bring down bison with ease, often shooting from the back of a moving train, making the slaughter both efficient and devastating. Cody's hunts were celebrated for their speed and precision, and his reputation grew as he became known as a legendary hunter. However, the effects of this mass killing were catastrophic. By the late 1800s, bison populations, once numbering in the millions, had dwindled to near extinction thanks to overhunting and habitat destruction. The bison's role as a keystone species for many Native American tribes was severely disrupted, and the loss of the bison also undermined the livelihoods of indigenous peoples who depended on them for food, clothing, and tools. While Cody's bison hunts were celebrated at the time as a demonstration of skill, they also symbolized the environmental and cultural devastation that occurred as settlers and railroad companies expanded westward. Governments have tried really hard that nothing like this would ever happen again. 15. Quick draw gunfights. Finally, the one that everyone's been waiting for, quick draw gunfights. The first recorded quick draw gunfight, a dramatic moment in Wild West history, took place in 1865 between the legendary lawman Wild Bill Hickok and a man named Davis Tutt in Springfield, Missouri. The duel was because of a gambling dispute that quickly escalated into a deadly confrontation. The conflict began when Tutt, who had been gambling with Hickok, failed to pay off a debt. Hickok had given Tutt some of his own money to cover his losses, but Tutt refused to settle up. The tension reached a breaking point when Tutt publicly displayed Hickok's prized pocket watch, which he had taken as collateral. Hickok, feeling his honor had been insulted, demanded the return of his watch and confronted Tutt in the town square. On the afternoon of July 21st, the two men faced off in a high-stakes duel. They stood 75 feet apart, facing each other in the middle of the street. With crowds of onlookers, the two men drew their guns, and Hickok, with his legendary speed, shot Tutt dead before he could even get a shot off. This quick-draw gunfight between Hickok and Tutt set the stage for the myth of the fastest draw in the West, and we've been seeing it everywhere ever since. Would you be able to survive any of these insanely weird things in the Wild West?